Okay, I think that we can get started. I just wanted to thank everybody for coming. If we have other people join in, they'll just be part of the conversation as we're going. National Mackinac Historical Society tonight is presenting Susan Sleeper Smith. We'll be talking about frontier women in the Mackinac Straits area and just a couple pointers for while we're in the presentation. Everybody's muted and we are recording the presentation so we can share it with all of you and share it later on our um, YouTube or Facebook or things like that. And we will have time at the end of the presentation for questions, but since everybody's muted, you can see in our little diagram here, there's a little chat box toward the bottom of your screen. Just hover your mouse over the bottom of the screen if you want to access the chat. You can type any questions in there, and then Susan and I will address those at the end. And like I said, we will be sharing the recording with all the participants that are here today. So without further ado, I would like to welcome Susan Sleeper Smith. And I will stop my screen sharing. So Susan, you can share your presentation.
Thank you, Rachel, very much. Okay. So this evening, I would like to talk to you about many of the indigenous women that lived up around the Straits and up to the Sioux who were engaged in the fur trade. And if we think about the fur trade, both north and south of the US border, the fur trade has generally been mythologized as a rather masculine landscape where only the most hardy men survived the rigors of the wilderness, while indigenous involvement has been masked by repeated myths about decline and demise. Now, this talk is going to focus on the Western Great Lakes, and I'm going to attempt to dispel much of the myth making that's associated with the fur trade and try to show you the way in which indigenous or Anishinaabeg women were engaged in the fur trade. So one way in which indigenous people exercised control over the fur trade is that we see that the types of goods that are transported into the Great Lakes and were actually manufactured in Europe, in either London or France, were actually manufactured for the Indian trade. And how do we know this? Well, there are in Montreal a group of records called the Montreal Merchants Records. And they list every type and every specific amount of trade good that French traders took into the Great Lakes. And so the Montreal Merchant Records primarily cover the French period from 1715 to 1760. Now, the French were there before, but for a while they closed the trade. And they began keeping very accurate records once the trade was reopened in 1715. And the interesting thing about these records is that they really list every type of item. And if you look at them, now this, for instance, is the amount of goods that came into Mackinac. And when you look at this, you can see very clearly that the largest amount coming in was what was categorized as clothing or was in essence cloth. And if you look at the right-hand column here, you will see that the percentage for Mackinac is 72.04%. If we look at Detroit, the amount of clothing coming into Detroit is even higher. It's over 75%. The interesting thing about this is if you look at weapons, weapons are non-existent at Detroit, and weapons, even at Mackinac, are less than 2% of what comes in. hunting equipment really covers about 12% of the trade goods transported. And this pretty much holds true for all of the trades, all of the posts in the Western Great Lakes. And at some level, we should probably call this the cloth trade rather than the fur trade, since almost 3/4 of the goods coming into the Great Lakes were cloth, as well as the items that were needed to transform the cloth into clothing. So scissors, thread, needles, these were all part of what accompanied that cloth. And if this is primarily a process based on cloth, then we can probably also conclude that Indian women exercised considerable influence on the types of goods that were actually exchanged for peltry. It was women that processed the furs that were sent to the Montreal market, and it was women who cut, sewed, and transformed trade cloth into clothing. Women produced clothing for the entire family. Men might know the rudiments of sewing, and they could actually probably repair their moccasins. But it was women who would create the clothing styles that characterized Indian dress. And these women were far more than ordinary seamstresses. They had the ability to cut and join cloth, but above all else, their embroidery and their beadwork transformed Indian dress into highly elaborate and distinctive apparel. This is what you're looking at right now, is a coat made in 1840. Almost all of these examples you're going to look at have been made early in the 18th century. And this is really decorated with glass beads and embroidered with cotton thread. And I'm going to show you as we go along examples of clothing from both the late 18th and early 19th century created by women. And what you're going to see is as the century progresses, most of this clothing becomes incredibly elaborate. And this is everyday apparel worn by men and women. You can find examples of almost all of this clothing in places like the Detroit Institute of Art, the Milwaukee Museum of Public Art, the Minnesota Historical Society, Cranbrook Institute of Science, which is just outside of Detroit, has just acquired a huge amount of clothing from the DIA. And of course, the Museum of the American Indian in DC also has a lot of the clothing from this period in the Great Lakes. Now, the legacy of the designs that you are going to see here, such as these bandolier bags, which both men and women used, can also be seen at powwows, where so much of this awe-inspiring clothing legacy remains apparent in the dress of the participants. When you look,
oh, I'm sorry, can we ask you to move your webcam up a little bit? It seems to have slipped down. We can't see your face anymore.
oh, okay.
Just, there we go.
Can you see it now?
Yes, that's perfect.
Okay.
Thank you.
So what I'm going to do is this is what we call cut work. And these are all small pieces of clothing or cloth, and they were then sewn, stitched on to trade cloth, and often these were stroud or very, very heavy felt. And this was primarily done in the Ohio River Valley. You can see here it circulated north up into Chippewa country and in Potawatomi wearing blankets, which are both at the DIA in Detroit. When cut work was not popular for very long in the North, and it was very quickly replaced by this incredibly elaborate embroidery style. And you can see here the curvilineal designs. This is what becomes very commonplace in the Northern Great Lakes. Now, I want to talk and just step back for a minute because Indian women really became the primary decision makers for most of the trade goods in the Great Lakes. This really took place because of the very unique nature of the fur trade in the Western Great Lakes. The first traders who ventured west really arrived in very large numbers in the late 1660s, and they were motivated by Radisson's very spectacular return to Montreal. He arrived in Montreal surrounded by a convoy of 60 canoes carrying 200,000 livres of peltry. Livre is a French term for money. And this was an incredible amount of wealth. It encouraged hundreds of young men to almost immediately leave Detroit and head west. Most of these young men had never been involved in the trade. They were not fluent in Indian languages, and they would wind up living for 18 months to 2 years in an Indian world surrounded by people whose languages they could not understand. How did these Frenchmen survive? They survived if they gained a foothold in the trade by marrying indigenous women. Now, marriage in the manner of the country provided numerous examples to both Indian women and French men. If we look briefly first at the advantages to marrying an Indian woman from the fur trader's perspective, the first thing we're going to find is that marriage to an Indian woman ensured fur traders an adequate supply of food. Obtaining food and an adequate supply was a primary concern. These men did not stay long enough to plant gardens, to grow food. They were completely dependent on indigenous people. And it really, in the Northern Great Lakes, corn was important, but rice was even more important for ensuring the survival of fur traders. Now, it was women, and you see here women in canoes gathering rice. It was women who controlled access to food. Now, a second advantage, I'll leave this up for a second, a second advantage that most traders experienced is that women were very skilled linguists. They generally came from villages where there were a multiplicity of different languages spoken, and they were going to, through marriage, help to facilitate the exchange process. Now, these women who lived with French traders also acquired the rudiments of the French language, and they very quickly emerged as intermediaries in the exchange process. And truthfully, a marital alliance with an Anishinaabeg woman provided traders access to peltry that was really provided by a woman's kin network. And women with extensive kin networks became highly desirable marital partners. Kin also provided labor that transported the peltry and provided protection for canoe brigades so that they could return safely to Detroit. Finally, Indian women were the processors of peltry. And this is true for all furs in the Great Lakes. Since women cleaned and stretched the skins, it required tremendous patience and time. Women owned the houses, and they commanded the labor of those living in those houses. They oversaw the other women who would process these pelts by flushing them over a round and pointed board that was several feet long and held at a 45-degree angle between the floor and their chest. This was really grueling work. These women leaned over the beam and drew a sharp knife back and forth across the skins to remove the connective tissue and muscle. Women drew their knives slowly across the pelt, very careful not to pierce the skin. Now, the thinnest sections of the pelt were often turned over to processing by older women who actually used their teeth to process the fragile sections. Indian women then stretched the beaver pelt around a circular hoop made from the small limbs of pliable tree branches. Pelts of different shapes required rectangular stretching frames. The skin was tied with string made from animal gut at 1-inch intervals around the edge of the pelt to secure it to the frame. In the late spring, after several months of drying, the furs were ready for the market. Indian women dried, compressed, and secured the peltry in packs. Each pack weighed about 100 pounds. And this peltry, when it was well pressed, really secured the largest quantity of best quality trade goods. Now, trapping and processing peltry was a winter task, and Indian hunters and French traders would not have survived the harsh subarctic environment without the work of Indian women. Indian women produced the clothing you see here. This was waterproof clothing, especially the leggings and moccasins, which were totally essential to any hunter's survival. People really only survived up in the Upper Peninsula because they had the clothing that protected them from the clothes, and also because women made the snowshoes that carried them across the snow. Now, this is what French fur traders got out of marriage to Indian women. But the real question is, why would an Indian woman marry a French fur trader? Well, first of all, it gave them access to a steady supply of trade goods. And their access to trade goods was going to enhance their authority and their status. Why were trade goods so important? Well, trade goods were given as gifts. They were given to seal alliances. They were given to affirm marital relationships. And in the case of death, they were given to dry the eyes of grieving families. These cultural responsibilities were ensured when these fur traders were drawn into indigenous kin networks. Marriage ensured that fur traders were drawn into this very predictable universe where reciprocity and generosity regulated their behavior. And marriage drew Indian women into the exchange process, not only as translators, but also negotiators in the exchange. Third, women really were incredible contributors on trading journeys. And there were quite a number of failed trading ventures that took place in the Great Lakes. And often they failed because there were no women as part of the trading group. Indigenous women often demanded and received preferential treatment on such journeys. One post commander in the Hudson's Bay Company accorded his female Ojibwa interpreter special privileges because, quote, he was amazed by this woman's resourcefulness. And he tells us in his journal that, quote, he felt obligated to give in to her demands, extra rations, and preferential treatment in order to prevent her defection, close quotes. By the mid-18th century, women began to emerge as independent traders. When the British replaced the French in the Great Lakes after the 7 Years' War, Indian women were granted licenses as fur traders. John Jacob Astor, who was probably one of our most famous American traders, When he sought an entree into the trade at Mackinac, he was able to secure this by employing Anishinaabeg women, women whose names will be familiar to us, women like Elizabeth Bertrand, Teresa Schindler, and Madame La Framboise. Although these women initially entered the trade as the wives of fur traders, they now emerged as independent when they were able to secure trading licenses. Throughout the Great Lakes and in the everyday world of the 18th century, Fort commandants like Cadillac even proposed that soldiers, French soldiers, be permitted to marry Indian women, thus cementing Indian relations to the French regime. His proposal really reflects the reality of fur trade society, where marriage, whether performed after the custom of the country or even legitimated by a Catholic priest, were integral to the exchange process. And these Indian women were very demanding customers. Both French and English manufacturers wove very specific types of cloth to meet their demand. North America's merchants transmitted highly specific instructions across the Atlantic. They detailed the color, the style, and even the weave of the cloth meant for Indian consumption. Merchants in London and La Rochelle in France were continually cautioned by fur traders to ensure that they shipped only high-quality goods manufactured specifically for the trade. Now, colonial merchants took out advertisements in which they claimed their wares were attractive to Indians. One Philadelphia merchant placed this ad in a Philadelphia paper, quote, he had an assortment of goods suitable for the Indian trade, consisting of Indian blanketing, best French match coats, best blue, red, and black London strouds, white and purple half ticks and ribbons, calicos, linens, and vermilion. What became of the ribbons, calicos, and linens that this merchant supplied to fur traders going west into the Great Lakes? While we look at some of the most popular items, especially the calicos, linens, and ribbons, we can readily see how they were incorporated into Indian dress. The pictures in these pictures were part of everyday dress, and we have numerous outside observers who confirm the elaborate nature of how Native people dressed. John Heckenwalder, a Moravian missionary who lived among the Indians in the Ohio River Valley and then among them in Canada, really provides this rather eye-opening appraisal of women's dress. And this is what he said. The women line their petticoats with blue or scarlet cloth, blankets, or covering with choice ribbons of various colors, or with gartering, on which they fix a number of silver brooches or small round buckles. They adorn their leggings in the same manner. Their moccasins are embroidered in the neatest manner with colored porcupine quills, and besides are almost entirely covered with various trinkets. They have, moreover, a number of little bells and brass thimbles fixed round their ankles, which when they walk make a tinkling noise, which is heard at some distance and which is intended to draw the attention of those who pass by, that they may look at and admire them. Now, dress also had a social function, and it enabled Indian villages to judge the loyalty and attitudes of strangers. Strangers entering an Indian village were welcomed if, quote, they wore a calico shirt made in the Indian fashion, trimmed with silver brooches and arm plates. Properly attired strangers were always assured hospitality. Now, white captives were also dressed in Indian fashion before being adopted. When Benjamin Allen was captured by the Shawnee, they took him to their wintering camp where they demanded that he remove his clothes. Quote, they brought 2 calico hunting shirts, sort of red with half the arm worn off, and put them on me, then tied a blanket around me with a buffalo tug, and then they placed a piece of blanket around my head. They then patted me on my head and said, Indian. Now, Allen's new clothing was the initial step in his adoption. By the mid-18th century, luxury goods were part of the fur trade. Silk cloth and ribbons, brocades, and especially silver ornaments. Now, during the earliest years of the trade, silver proved so popular that Montreal and Quebec silversmiths melted down silver coins to produce sufficient ornaments for the fur trade. And in fact, the New France governor ordered the stoppage of such melting down of the coinage because New France was running out of silver coin. And in fact, silver became such a common feature of the exchange process that its presence is one of the single best criteria for dating archaeological sites from 1760 to 1820. Silver manufactured for this trade had an incredible variety. It included gorgets, brooches, crosses, armbands, wristbands, earbobs, ear wheels, hair pipes, hair plates, animal effigies, lockets, hat bands, crowns, and even cradle boards decorated with silver. Silver brooches were large, medium, and small. They would transform women's daily dress. These were the items that women most frequently wore. They are also so abundant that today you can still find silver brooches like this available in gift shops or often on auction sites. George Winter, an Indiana artist of the 1830s, sketched Indian women who had silver brooches so closely aligned that they bore the appearance of silver shawls. During the last decade of the 18th century, when Indian access to their homelands was contested by the federal government, Indian women used silver, especially the brooches they wore, as one means of securing wealth when they were forcibly removed to the West. A brooch could be easily detached from clothing and used as currency. The most popular brooch forms were circular, ornate discs, or round, pierced brooches with a hinged plate that fastened the brooch to the garment. You see on the right an eagle, brooches which were manufactured during the period that the United States came into the Great Lakes and signified allegiance to the United States. Now, Henry Hamilton, who commanded at Detroit during the Revolutionary War, sketched an important portrait of a Miami headman, Pecan, from Miami town, which was one of the largest indigenous trading towns in the Ohio River Valley. Now, his everyday dress included silver ornaments in his ears, and you can see that the silver ornaments hanging down from Pecan's ears are almost 12 inches in length. You can also see on his arm the decoration of additional brooches. You can see a silver band around his head. And Indian men wore silver ornaments plated in their ears. And many Indians had half-moon gorgets around their necks, or in the case of this Miami leader during the American regime, a case that extended down from his neck that was surrounded by silver armbands. And you can also see the silver armbands on his arm. The most prolific silversmiths were located in Montreal and Detroit. Narcissus Roy was a silversmith. He produced almost 9,000 silver ornaments. In 1801, Robert Cruikshank, who was a Montreal silversmith, had several apprentices who produced and supplied more than 49,000 silver pieces for the trade. And if we assume that the volume of silver production stayed constant just for a 10-year period, Cruikshank would have produced more than 1 million pieces of trade silver in his lifetime. This is Tenskwatawa, who was Tecumseh's brother. He absolutely railed against European trade goods, but his dress reflected the trends in fur trade clothing that were apparent in Indian villages throughout the Great Lakes. When the fur trade was at its 18th century height, new styles of dress spread rapidly to other villages throughout the Great Lakes. Now, following the War of 1812, both the United States and British Canadian officials attempted to assert control over the upper Great Lakes, while hotly debating the international border that would divide them. Now, Sault Ste. Marie, and you can see on the map, there were two Sault Ste. Maries, one in Canada, one in Michigan, and this was at the edge of the border being disputed between the British and the Americans. And based on the treaty signed after the Revolutionary War, Americans claimed the south side of the St. Mary's River. And both British and United States asserted claims to all the land surrounding the Sioux, but truthfully, they lacked the ability to extend any political influence in this area. Sault Ste. Marie at that time spanned both sides of the river, and the frequent crossings along this still imaginary border were part of daily life for Indigenous people. As late as 1831, a visitor to the Sioux community noted that most of the inhabitants had Indigenous wives and that all of the young women were Anishinaabe. Along the St. Mary's River and the shoreline of Lake Superior, Ojibwa women outnumbered women of Euro-American descent until the end of the 19th century. While the British and Americans faced off, prominent female fur traders began asserting control over the various valuable resources in the region. They secured control of land as well as some of the largest maple groves in the region. You see here a picture of Susan Johnson. She was born into an esteemed Ojibwa family near the southwestern end of Lake Superior, and she married the Irish fur trader John Johnston in the manner of the country. Whoops, sorry, wrong way. So there were several other, I'm going to go back up to Susan Johnston. There were several other Anishinaabe female traders in the area, particularly including the sisters Teresa Marcotte and Madeleine Marcotte. Therese first married a French fur trader, and after the couple separated at the turn of the 19th century, she then married George Schindler, who was a trader at Mackinac Island in 1804. Now, even before George Schindler died in 1825, Therese Schindler took over her husband's fur trading business. Her sister, Magdalene, married French fur trader Joseph Laframboise in the manor of the country in 1794. But later, her marriage was sanctified in the Catholic Church. When Joseph died in 1806 on a trading journey, he was killed by several irate Odawa. She took over his trade routes and routes that stretched from Michilimackinac to the Grand River Valley of Michigan, where she had been born. Now, in the 1820s and 30s, as the demand for furs declined, most of these Anishinaabe women weathered the economic changes affecting the region by focusing on maple sugar production. There is limited evidence about the economic details of their specific transactions, but we can very clearly understand that the camps that were owned by these women became almost as profitable as the fur trade. Susan Johnston started her sugar camp at the turn of the 19th century on Sugar Island, which you see here, which is in the St. Mary's River, and she returned annually to that camp until the 1830s. Other women tied, Anishinaabe women tied to the fur trade, also ran very large sugar camps. For instance, Teresa Schindler's camp had over 1,000 trees, and her camp was located just south of Mackinac Island on Bois Blanc Island. Now, the women who owned these camps oversaw all of the activities needed to convert sap to maple sugar. This is an Ojibwa woman preparing bark baskets for collecting the sap. You see here the iron pots that came from the fur trade where the maple syrup was boiled down. You see the later invention of aluminum pots to the left on the trees catching the maple sap. Now this is Teresa Schindler. This is Bois Blanc Island where her sugar camp was. And she, like her sister, Madame La Framboise, spent most of her life as a trader, and she lived at the Straits of Mackinac. She used maple sugar to pay for her trade goods. She purchased items like sewing silk, taffeta ribbons, silk shawls, multiple yards of cotton fabrics, fine men's shoes, sealskin shoes, and alcohol, particularly Madeira wine, sherry, port, and even whiskey. During the same period that Anishinaabe women were producing large amounts of maple sugar, they also played a central role in political negotiations and used that influence to shape politics in the region. They participated in treaty councils. They drew on their knowledge of indigenous political systems, including kinship networks, to form new relationships with the American newcomers. They were increasingly involved in treaty negotiations. In 1823, for instance, the Odawa transferred a tract of land along the Grand River in Michigan, about 50 miles inland from the eastern shore, to Madame La Framboise, or Magdalene La Framboise. The grant stated that the Indian tribes of the Grand River are connected by blood with Madeleine La Framboise of Mackinac, and we are desirous of doing good unto her and her offspring, close quotes. Madame La Framboise and her sister Teresa Schindler retained control of their properties on Mackinac Island and were granted cash payments in treaties that allowed them to pay the taxes on those houses. In 1823, Susan Johnson's daughter, Jane, married Henry Rose Schoolcraft, the recently arrived United States Indian agent. And like her mother, Jane incorporated newcomers into her Ojibwa kinship network, and she drew on her newly expanded kinship networks from her daughter's marriage to become an active participant at subsequent treaty negotiations between the Lake Superior Anishinaabe and the American federal government. Through their involvement with treaties, these female traders secured land for their villages and for themselves. Rather than leading down the pathway to ruin, The fur trade exposed Indians to European trade goods, which they really acquired and appropriated for their own use, and to which they gave new meanings. The images which I've shown in this talk, the historical written records, and the archaeological evidence reflect a past in which change was part of daily life for Indian. Indian identity has often been elided or silenced in the documentary records because we have a static portrait of traditional Indians, and we tend to believe the authentic Indians were unchanging. Rarely do we imagine the evolution of a new social world as Indians integrated Europe's manufactured goods into the dress of their everyday life and continued to remain a formidable presence in the upper Great Lakes. The pictures that you've seen today are not those of a vanishing race, but of a colorful, multi-ethnic society fashioned in part by a fur trade economy. The fact that most of the women discussed today were born in indigenous villages, married fur traders, were then licensed as independent traders, diversified their economic holdings when the fur trade declined, and continued to hold property in the region, stretching from the Sioux to Mackinac, attests both to their success and the ongoing ability of indigenous women to survive and thrive, even in dire economic times. Thank you. That ends my talk.
Thank you so much, Susan. That was very interesting. We did have a question from Lana Hasper. She said, where did all the silver come from that they used to make their brooches?
Well, actually, most of the silver at this time comes from Mexico. You don't want to go into the trade. It's silver mining is not a very pleasant aspect of what happened to indigenous people in Mexico, but the Spanish were the largest silver traders in the world. They mined more silver and gold in South America than any other country, and the silver was traded in the European market, brought to New France, and made its way into the Western Great Lakes.
Excellent. And then Teresa Weller told us that locals call, I believe it was Vobla Island, Bablo, which I have heard several times.
Yes, I've heard that too.
So I'm going to put up our
What happens is I tend to use the names that most people are going to recognize.
Mm-hmm. Well, I want to thank everybody for coming. We really appreciate it. We hope you enjoyed the presentation, and we do have a few more programs up on our website as well. If you'd like to go to our website, you can join our mailing list there. We also have our Facebook page, and that has all of our programs and current events happening at the Historical Society on there as well. So again, thank you everybody for coming, and we hope to see you at one of our programs again soon. Have a good night and a good weekend, everybody.
Stay safe.